Alright, Shadow of the Erdtree. Certainly a DLC that contains some really difficult encounters, requiring you to fight tooth and nail if you want to stand a chance to survive such an ordeal. So how about we approach this in the most literal sense possible, by using the new Tooth Whip and the Glintstone nails. Two spells and even a consumable version for whatever reason, which are bound to turn this run into quite a nail biter. The main problem, of course, is that whips are arguably the least beneficial weapon class, and the new DLC variant doesn't even appear to be among the best the whip class has to offer. However, it might actually have some benefits in some situations. Of course, the final boss is not an example of that. Yeah. I mean, that fight alone probably decreased my lifespan by 2 decades. But hey, on the other hand, perhaps this run will make me at least feel like a young whippersnapper. So let's hope that the new Tooth Whip is not all bark but no bite. And hey, the spells are projectiles with some peculiar form of homing ability, so I can't imagine that those would make the game hard as nails. Or perhaps those turn out to be far less beneficial than you might expect. Regardless, get ready to ride the Tooth Ferry across the River Styx, because whether this will turn into a hellish experience or not, when playing as a dentist turned manicurist, you cannot hand-wave away the fact that there's bound to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Alright, time to sink our teeth into a new challenge, and this is the best I could come up with to mimic a dentist outfit. Although dentists of course normally help you get rid of rotting teeth, and not whip you over the head with them. Then again, I don't know about the American healthcare system. Regardless, I'm only armed with a little toothpick that's exclusively for Golden Vow, and we seemingly don't have access to either of our methods for dealing damage. However, appearances can be deceiving because the Lands of Shadow holds several secret paths. Because if you search this particular area with a comb of the fine tooth variety, you will discover an alternate route towards the whip of the not so fine tooth variety. And this allows us to reach Miss Sinclair's birth village, deepest lore by the way, without fighting Relanna first. All you have to do is enter Morph Ruins and then go into the right hole, or dare I say in this context, cavity. And there we have the Tooth Whip. Wow, that really looks disgusting. This is kind of what I would imagine the Dung Eater's teeth would look like. Or the ones of a random British person. But the lore is pretty damn metal, a la Jaws. You know, the Bond villain, not the shark. And it has a unique weapon art. Well, technically it's actually from Dark Souls 3. But it's an ability called Painful Strike. And in every sense of the word, because tooth decay can lead to some pretty intense suffering.
The pain. The pain.
But even though we're now armed to the teeth, we gotta make sure that we don't bite off more than we can chew, because even though the consumable version of the Glintstone nail appears useless at first glance, and also at any consecutive glance, who knows, it might actually rescue us from the jaws of defeat when we're in a pinch. However, that does not apply to the draconic jaws of the ancient dragon man, since he is standing in our way, so time to whip out our new weapon and take it for a spin. Although we're technically not here by necessity, but I learned about a not so widely known shortcut in my perfume run that we can access through Dragon Peak. Moreover, we need to test out our weapon first, and we immediately notice that the one benefit the whip has is that it can stun lock humanoid enemies very effectively as long as they don't have any poise. The R1s have pretty nice range as well, and the weapon art is a beneficial multi-hit, which can help with the poison buildup since that is so much lower than it should have been. And this weapon doesn't have an arcane scaling for whatever reason. Pretty big oversight if you ask me. Unfortunately, the weapon art has a special ability that only applies to PvP, at least as far as I'm aware, namely that it lowers an enemy's stamina regen. Now, the green light effect that indicates that it's active does in fact show up on any enemy, NPC or not. But I sincerely doubt that it has an actual additional effect in PvE. So yeah, that's quite a kick in the teeth already. But at the very least against NPC enemies, this weapon allows you to lash out at them quite lavishly. However, I don't expect any destructive dental devastation against any actual bosses in this DLC. But the reason we're here in the first place is because if we go from the Ancient Dragon Man towards the Ancienter Dragon, actual dragon, we can reach the cookbook that we need via a shortcut. And it looks quite dangerous, but if you just wing it, you can safely make your way down there without going all the way around through the Cerulean coast. However, the problem with the Glinting nail, other than the practically useless amount of damage that it does, is that it's a massive pain in the cuticle to actually craft it in large amounts. Given that you need to ride across the finger runes to pick up nailstones while getting fired at, but then you also need to farm those very enemies, called lamprey. What in the holy frick? I thought that was a Pinocchio character. Oh, and of course their drop rate is low and they can even drop the wrong crafting items. Wow, this really sucks. In the end I only had 3 of them, so yeah. These nails are bound to leave barely a scratch. Perhaps if you have 99 int it might actually leave a mark. But to make things worse, you can only hold 10 of them in the first place. Wow, thank you From Software. I mean, we don't want anyone to become overpowered, right? Jeez. Well, at least the number makes sense if it's specifically meant to symbolize fingernails. Although I'm surprised that there are no toenails involved, given Miyazaki's influence, but I'm certainly not complaining in that regard. However, I'm not above complaining about now having to bare our fangs at the carnivorous cavitating camera known as the Dancing Lion. Although it's actually just 2 guys in a suit. Then again, those who tend to profit most from Lion usually wear an expensive looking suit. Also a shame that I cannot wield a chair in my left hand to help me tame this beast. And another unfortunate thing is that I cannot fully profit from my weapon art in this entire run, given that I don't have access anymore to the Shard of Alexander that would have provided a 15% damage boost. So we'll have to make do with the 10% from the regular Warrior Shard. Regardless, you can only use the weapon art effectively up close anyway. In fact, the entire reach of the whip is annoyingly deceptive, because I was pretty shocked how often I actually missed my attacks during this entire run. I mean, is this a whip or a whiff? In any case, it's certainly not a cool whip, given that the charge R2 attacks have this awkward sideways motion rather than going straight forward. Nevertheless, even if you could get consistent charge R2 attacks in, you cannot repose with this weapon to begin with. So the weapon art would be the best choice for quick poison buildup, but that's also not really the case. Now, I did manage to poison this boss, but overall throughout this run, those moments are actually quite rare. Because remember that the buildup is already low and cannot be increased by any means. And also keep in mind that when you do proc it, their resistance will increase for any additional proc. On a side note, by the way, given that this boss consists of 2 guys in a costume, it would have made sense and it would have been very beneficial if there would have been 2 lock-on points as well. Because when you get behind him, it often results in your attacks missing since you attack towards the head, when you should be attacking the center or the back of the boss. Meaning that the most beneficial approach is to kind of juggle between lock-on and locking off whenever the situation calls for it. So I suppose that the people who are capable of using claw grip have a massive advantage in this fight, because in principle, playing without lock-on at all removes the disastrous camera altogether. Because when you do have to rely on lock-on, this fight feels like pulling teeth at times. Regardless, even without a chair in my left hand, I still managed to tame this lion. And given the lack of said chair, I'm better off acquiring the 2-handed talisman for a very significant damage boost. However, keep in mind that this does not apply to the weapon art. That's what the Warrior Shard is for. But perhaps this additional damage boost will result in a very satisfying experience against Relanna. Now, of course, given our previous shortcut, the most satisfying experience would be going in for the back door. But Miyazaki deciding to cockblock us from doing so isn't exactly as rare as Hand's Teeth. But then again, at the very least there's another shadow fragment if you take the normal route. On top of that, Relanna is apparently very susceptible to poison. Of course, the problem there is hitting her consistently enough to actually apply it. And although you might think that I would have the reach advantage, Again, the reach of the whip is very deceptive and only regular R1s truly go straight forward. But Relanna's sword's reach is deceptively longer and she moves with seemingly infinite stamina. Which, once again, we cannot affect with the weapon art despite the visual indication. Shame that they didn't alter the effect for PvE, like when the effect is active, the enemy in question takes more poise damage, for example. But to make it worse, she can actually jump out of the weapon art's multi-hit, because actual bosses cannot be stunned by it. Fortunately, there are still some attack and or healing opportunities that are easy to recognize amidst the apparent chaos. Namely after she shoots the low projectiles and jumps towards you, or when she ends a combo by holding her sword to the side. So those were the main things I looked out for to either attack or heal. And during a moon attack, remember that your only goal is to jump over the wave and not the moon itself, because you can leave that to cows found in nursery rhymes. But in the end, since I didn't expect to get anything useful out of the consumable nails, other than consuming them for breakfast, I decided to use them to finish the fight when she hardly had any HP remaining, and holy molar, what an incredibly useless item. Because even 3 of those were still barely enough for that little bit of health remaining. Fortunately, it won't be the final nail in anyone's coffin, since the spell versions are available once we reach the second finger ruins behind Shadow Keep. Although we also have to make sure that we collect everything and do the quest lines for the gang fight later on and whatnot. And I thought this would be easy to navigate, but I guess I'll have to bite my tongue.
Let's go and navigate the American healthcare system. It's the best system of them all.
No, we already talked to the insurance company. They were supposed to talk to you.
We go back to the doctor, we go back to the specialist who talks to the insurance company. The facts is the medical advisors on the phone in the morning. And we're going in one place and we're coming out the other place. And we're back over here now and I was just over there. And I'm getting confused and it's getting dark. And my mind is all different colors and I think I'm lost. Hey fellas, I think I'm lost in the American healthcare system. Fellas, help!
Well, after all of that, we might as well take on Gyobor before heading to the Finger Runes. Because other than the collection of Skibidi fragments behind him, I ironically have some beef with this pork right. Because I still don't know how to deal with the annoying charge attack.
The pig goes whack.
Yeah, and on top of that, this swift-moving swine mount definitely wins in the thief department. You know, instead of Gaius, they should have called his boss the Count of Tuscany or something. Yeah, I definitely don't have a decent understanding of his moveset yet, but that applies basically to all the bosses in this DLC at this point, to be honest. In fact, I wasn't even sure whether the gravity jump was iframeable, but it was. And I thought that he was designed to do the gravity orb afterwards, but that's not necessarily the case either. So for the most part, the opposite of what I expected turned out to be true. So perhaps dodging in the opposite direction might be beneficial, since I tend to dodge to my left. But if you dodge to his left, given that he is right-handed, you tend to avoid a lot of attacks just by positioning alone. So following my instincts would end up biting me in the ass, but doing the opposite allowed me to bite his boar in the butt with my gangrenous Gnasher Lasher. Regardless, rather than chewing his ass out or giving him the finger, and no, I don't mean a la Bloodborne doing visuals on pigs, I'd better head towards the Finger Runes. Oh, by the way, why does the Oh Mother gesture look like you're offering someone a sword? Or in this case a giant toothbrush, I suppose. Now technically this would be the perfect place to farm for consumable nails, but obviously now we're going for the spell versions. Technically you can get those before fighting Metyr, but the catalyst can only be acquired afterwards. So despite having the power of nails at my fingertips, let's go and bite the hand that feeds us a lot of bullshit actually. Because to be honest, so far, other than appearance-wise, I don't have a very high opinion on Metyr that much yet, mechanically speaking. Although in all fairness, she gave me a thumbs down as well, so yeah. But the thing is that I just don't comprehend some pretty extreme moves that she can do. Like, how do you avoid the giant laser? At least the very first one. Oh, and for the multi-lasers, just move behind her, they said. Yeah, well, they were lying through her teeth because it goes straight through her body. Come on, From Software, is her body made out of wool or something? Well, at least the weapon art is good for the small hands. because if you're lucky you can take all of them out at once. However, against Metyr herself, it's not doing a whole lot. In fact, all in all, I simply wasn't doing a lot of damage against her. The main issue was that I simply kept running out of healing, because even though you would think I'm smart as a whip, which you are all definitely thinking, right? Huh? But I just couldn't figure out how to avoid so many of her attacks. In fact, for the giant laser, it's better to just not even try to avoid it, as to not take instability damage. And while you're waiting, you can use Golden Vow. Other than that, it's praying for good RNG, or better said, keep your fingers crossed. Well, at least afterwards, as I've mentioned before, NPC fights are much easier with this weapon. So I lavishly last the less, and then mulverized the new mother. Mulverized. So I got the new spells, and technically there are 3, but the third one is not specifically about nails, so I wasn't sure whether or not to include it. But more about that specific spell later on. But what I mostly wasn't sure about was the new outfit. Yeah, if this is the attire of a manicurist, then even I would prefer to become a pedicurist instead. Yuckalicious. But I would definitely need to boost. After all, we're not going to go completely without the wisdom of the Tooth Whip, but we'll have to respec into wisdom that's not related to the tooth variety, and even arcane since the staff scales with both. However, that means that even being this high level, we don't get the full strength possible for these spells. Especially not while at least keeping the base level stats for the whip. Because that is a dexterity weapon, even though it definitely should have had an arcane scaling. So let's hope that this doesn't turn it into a superfluous incisor string. Regardless, the thing is that we can now at least focus on the nail spells instead. And the damage was a little underwhelming. Well, that's not completely true. Because if you think that you would do a lot of damage if you hit the nails on the head, then you have definitely hit the nail on the head. But the thing is that the homing properties of this spell isn't much of an actual homing property. It basically just zigzags all over the place, which can in fact mean that it hits the target after initially missing, but more often than not, it misses even when firing up close. Simply put, it's fickle as fuck. And apparently this boss is rather magic resistant, and only really weak against fire. Which makes sense since flour is one of the main ingredients when baking something. But although the damage seems fine enough when getting headshots, it simply requires a ton of FP to make it through 3 health bars, especially since we cannot repose for a reduced 2nd and 3rd health bar. And the thing is that when fighting this boss from a distance, it's your own health bar that you have to worry about, because then the boss just keeps spamming thorn AoEs. In fact, even the uncharged projectile can be too slow at times. So my thinking was to at least then get as much damage out of the charged projectiles as possible by acquiring the Godfrey icon from Godfrey. By the way, even here the nail spells are underwhelming, given how this is a relatively early game boss fight. Regardless, now I'm definitely doing more damage, but the thing is that for how much extra FP it takes, the multi-shot is not really worth it over the single nail, which is at least FP efficient. But to be fair, despite that, I would take regular Glintstone pebbles over this inconsistent garbage anyway. In fact, fighting this boss in this playthrough was harder than on my blind playthrough. Tough as nails in fact, to the point that near the end I was completely out of flash. Playing with this spell against this boss feels like what my attire looks like. A complete abomination rather than finger licking good. But despite that, using my nails, I at least managed to scrape by. And so, after we nailed the sunflower until it varnished into thin air, which is a shame since I could have turned the vines into dental floss, but the thing is that I decided to see if these spells fare at least a little better against a boss that is a bit more squishy. And the Orphan of Horus has far less health than most of the bosses in this DLC. And we do in fact inflict pretty decent damage when fully charged. But we only get very specific moments for charging, and you get punished heavily if you try to squeeze in an extra attack. But at least you can get a hit in when he rides away, or during the blue flame attacks. Although you can't attack while jumping, of course. But even so, it's still more awkward to fight him with range attacks than using melee. And you might say, just pretend you're fighting melee and shoot spells from up close. Well, that was my thinking as well, but remember that the tracking is all over the place and you can never predict whether you'll actually hit him, meaning that there is no guarantee that you'll actually hit him even at point blank range. Again, very fickle spell. And this boss is a master at roll catching and punishing greed. So I might be the one nailing him, but I'm the one getting hammered. In more ways than one, because remember that mouthwash contains alcohol. Gluk, 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 gluk. By the way, people are saying that the multi-nails are at least great for poise breaking. But in all honesty, I haven't noticed any of that. Which might be because the DLC bosses seem to recover their poise much more quickly than bosses in the main game. And also don't leave that many opportunities to get multiple shots in a row. At the very least, I didn't break poise with it. Basically, at all. But hey, come on, against Bayle, this should be perfect given how tough it can be to hit his head with melee weapons. And yes, initially it seemed very effective. Fighting him from range is definitely a benefit. Although he can of course close the distance very quickly, when he wants to. And when he punishes you, he does it with raging intensity. To be expected of course that he is so ferocious, because I'm not exactly going out on a limb here when I say that we can't expect him to flee with his tail between his legs. What was less obvious is that I tried to get some extra damage in when underneath him, trying to apply poison with my whip, but despite the multiple multi-hits, I just couldn't get it to proc. And I know for sure that he isn't immune, so that was very confusing. Heck, even Bayle himself couldn't figure out what was going on, or where he was, or something. No idea what was happening here. Maybe he lost a little bit of brain against Placidus X as well. But all in all, of course, the recurring issue once more is that I'm just too inexperienced with the movesets of these new bosses that I take damage too frequently. So yes, unironically, a lot of the failure in this playthrough was a skill issue. You know, actually, it seems to be that the most effective way to fight him, using these spells, was to use the uncharged attack with the single nail. Of course, that is a pretty, a boring way to fight him. There's a reason I prefer melee over magic, or at least when using magic, it's interesting if they have some unique animations. And well, there is a remaining finger sorcery, which I originally planned to use for a completely separate run, but yeah, it's not really all that effective. Of course, the main purpose of this spell is to deflect projectiles. However, it does have the benefit that even if you get knocked out of the casting animation, the attack still goes through. But of course this type of hitbox is not so effective against a dragon head floating above you. And the charged version is a very lengthy animation. You know what, let's bail on the Bayle fight for now. Because I was pretty much considering going back to my dental day job. But I think it's fair to give the nails one more try. I mean, greedy fingers and a butt go together quite well, and we even have the saint of a butt in this DLC. And well, the damage is pretty poor, and unlike with Bayle, staying at a distance doesn't work against this boss that well, as she can easily punish you from across the arena. And she becomes much easier to deal with up close. So therefore I decided to pull my fingers out again, since those obviously only work when up close, and to reiterate, still go off even when taking a hit. But then again, I cannot just tank my way through either. And given how fast she moves, they also miss quite a lot, wasting valuable FP, and it's already not a very FP efficient spell. On top of that, the damage to FP ratio is also quite poor, meaning I was forced to finish it off with the whip anyway, when running out of FP. At least that's what I tried to do, but nothing in my current setup boosts the damage of my whip, and I had only the minimal dexterity requirements. So that was the final nail in the coffin, and I decided to go back to my original setup. Or better said, I simply turned it around. Meaning that now I have the minimal required stats for the nails, and everything else is to boost the power of my whip. It's kind of ironic that using the nails was like pulling teeth, while using the Tooth Whip was actually often quite handy. Well, comparatively speaking at least. Het is altijd lente in de ogen van de tandartsassistenten. Wow, that has to be the most obscure reference I ever made. But the results kind of speak for themselves, because basically we do about as much damage as with the spells, without requiring FP. Of course, unless I'm using the weapon art. Speaking of which, the Scarlet Kick recovery is unfortunately too fast for the weapon art. Same applies to a charger too, and depending on what she does next, even for 2 R1s. But despite that, all in all, Romina is actually a relatively forgiving boss to fight, especially since some of her attacks seem to miss almost at random. Even the butterfly explosion seems to be a little iffy, but in your benefit. However, she does suffer a bit from Moon Presence syndrome, where I have a hard time distinguishing between what counts as an attack animation and what is her simply moving and flailing around. Which is befittingly quite a pain in the butt. Now, you would think that the nail spells would no longer serve any purpose right now, but as I said early on in the video, it might just help you out when in a pinch. And I was in one hell of a pinch near the end of the Bayle fight, when relying solely so far on the whip, which is not an effective weapon against him. I pretty much had to rely on jump attacks to get at least somewhat decent damage out of it, but in the end, he damaged me a lot more, to the point that I was out of healing. So close, yet so far away. Wow, I literally hit the nail on the head if I said I survived by the skin of my teeth. Unfortunately, immediately afterwards that also applied to the spammers in the catacombs, who apparently use a Gatling gun version of the nail spell. Nail gun! Oh, by the way, since you probably want to reset at the Stake of America, simply drop down the elevator for a quick reset. You don't have to wait for it to go all the way down. Although I then realized I wasted my rune arc. Oh, and I also forgot to use my flask before entering the Forkwall. So execution-wise perhaps not so ideal. But at least the Ash of War does a lot of damage against this waste of space of a boss fight. However, it does not make him flinch. So it basically comes down to tanking. Therefore I suppose I should have equipped the Golden Braid. And obviously I forgot to do it, of course, since it seems to be that all his spells are holy damage. Also, I thought that he was immune to poison, but at the end he did get poisoned after all. After so many of my multi-hits. So that goes to show how poor the build-up is on this whip, and or how high his poison resistance is. Well, he is a shit boss, so I suppose that he's even more of a dung eater than the actual dung eater. So not much tooth decay that I can add to that, I suppose.
When you fall off that horse, you get right back up and you eat that horse.
Speaking of the weapon art, given that Midra tends to have more attack opportunities than a lot of other bosses in this DLC, I thought it would be very beneficial to focus on my weapon art and boost multi-hits. But yeah, even though I thought spamming multi-hits would work, I think he had the same strategy in mind. Oh, but I did manage to stagger him, by the way. Which is not that surprising given his low poise, but it was even less helpful than expected, because he automatically recovers from any hit afterwards, evidently. And this is a type of boss that definitely becomes a lot more tricky when you cannot exploit his primary weakness, which is definitely his low poise. But instead of whipping myself into a frenzy, after all he is the hothead here, so I decided to go for the two-handed talisman instead, and focus on the regular attacks, or even jump attacks when possible. Unfortunately, he also has the same poison resistance as Bayle does, but at least you can hit him more frequently. But yeah, once more, the poison gave me almost no benefit at all. But hey, no reason to set my teeth on edge, because using the nails would have been much worse, given that this boss is much more dangerous from a distance than up close.
Okay. I'm doing my very best. Thanks, that was way too much heat on my neck.
Regardless, despite being the Lord of Frenzy Flame, the Frenzy part was more dangerous than the Flame part. However, with Messmer, using the 20% fire negation talisman seems to make a significant difference. Of course, that's not going to save you when he unleashes the Shadow of Yharnam's Serpent summon. I mean, that is pretty much what it comes down to, right? And likely very much intentionally, given that this entire DLC seems to make reference to pretty much all previous titles, including Bloodborne with the Winter Lanterns, a weapon modeled after the Orphan of Cos Placenta, and in this case, the Shadow Serpents. Which is honestly pretty based, but yeah, that's why they call him the Base Serpent. Well, at least in this playthrough, the by now unfriendly fuckfest at the end wasn't as big of a deal with the whip. In fact, even the nail was somewhat useful. However, it is important to keep in mind that you need to two-hand the whip, otherwise, especially Freya, could still just poise through your attacks, instead of getting stun-locked. But after that, there was obviously one final kick in the teeth. The massive barrier at the end of any challenge in this DLC. So I think I need some additional motivation and inspiration for this one. So, Rani and Co, perhaps you could set the mood for this final encounter.
Just go be Snaggletooth.